Hello, and welcome to the podcast series, Flood Justice in the US-Mexico Borderlands, La Justicia de Inundaciones en las Fronteras de México y Estados Unidos, or Flood Justice en las Fronteras for short. I'm your host, Lucas Belury. Flood Justice en las Fronteras focuses on the issues of flooding and injusticia along the US-Mexico border. This podcast is a bilingual Spanish and English series. In this first episode, which will be conducted in English, we will focus on Ambos Nogales, a region in southern Arizona and northern Sonora, Mexico. We will also release a Spanish language episode of this region. Next in the series will be an episode that focuses on the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo Delta of South Texas and Northeastern Matamoros in English and Spanish. This podcast has been supported by the Mellon Fronteridades Digital Humanities Grant, and technical support is being provided by the Journal of the Southwest. Today, I will be interviewing Dr. Adriana Zuniga-Terán. Dr. Zuniga-Terán is an assistant professor of geography at the University of Arizona and holds a dual appointment at the Udall Center for Public Policy. Dr. Zuniga-Terán's research focuses on water security, urban resilience, and environmental justice, and she has published extensively about the US-Mexico border. Doctora, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Lucas. Thank you for having me.
Well, Doctora, let's go ahead and dive right in. Adriana, I was hoping we could just start by situating ourselves. Currently, you and I are in the podcast studio at the University of Arizona in Tucson, Arizona. Could you give us some context about where we are from a social and environmental perspective?
Yeah, of course. I'm proud to say that we are located in one of the most interesting regions in the world, in the Sonoran Desert. One of the deserts the desert with the most biodiversity ever. We have a very unique ecosystem where we have two precipitation or rainy seasons, the monsoons in the summer that are spectacular, really, and they provide torrential storms, but also we have a winter rain season that we have more steady rains and gives a lot of life to this ecosystem. Our rivers are dry because we've used most of our surface water. We are mostly dependent on groundwater and water from the Colorado River that is conveyed all the way here. We have the riparian areas that are still, some of them quite spectacular, with cottonwoods, and there are some areas with perennial flows, with actual water on the rivers, which are really, really precious. And socially, this area has been inhabited for thousands of years. We know of the Hohokams, this wonderful civilization that really knew how to use water and farm in these dry areas. Then we saw the Spaniards here, the Mexicans, and then it became a U.S. territory in the late 1800s and Arizona as a state in 1912. But today, Arizona is home of 22 federally recognized tribes, and surely other tribes that have not been federally recognized. But here in this area, we are located in the unceded land of the Tohono O'odham and Pasquayaqui tribes. And the area on the borderlands, which is the focus of this podcast, the Santa Cruz County is the poorest county in the state, and that's not odd for the US-Mexico border. All the border counties on the U.S. side are the poorest on those states. So if you put all the counties on the borderlands together, it would be the poorest state of the nation. But in contrast, on the Mexican side, it's a richer side of the country. Mexico is a poor country, so the northern area that is adjacent to the U.S. attracts many people, and it's richer than other areas of the country, mostly through the NAFTA that brought a lot of maquiladoras and job opportunities to this area, and that gave a lot of economic input to this area. So lots of contrast on economic and social side in the borderlands.
Thank you. Thank you so much for briefly detailing this very rich history that we can barely touch on today. And one thing that many people are surprised by when I tell them about flooding in southern Arizona and northern Sonora is that we have this flooding issue despite the fact that we're in a desert. I'm wondering if you could just walk me through a little bit about how and why flooding transpires here.
Yes, I know it's odd. I mean, how can you have flooding in the desert? But we only have flooding where the humans have interceded with the landscape, where there are cities where we put impervious surfaces, asphalt, concrete, buildings, and we did it not in the very smart way at the beginning. We're trying to correct that. But the flooding happens in these urban areas where there's asphalt, concrete, and then we paved many times the actual rivers in some cases, and we could probably talk more about that because that's the case of Nogales. But yes, that's what the odd thing about flooding in the desert happens. So in the rural areas, in the open landscape, the natural landscape, there's no flooding. There's some runoff that goes, but eventually it gets infiltrated or it gets directed to the washes, to the natural system of drainage, and it's part of the ecosystem of the hydrological cycle, and there's not actual flooding there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for detailing that. The theme of this podcast, Adriana, as I said before, is flood justice in the borderlands. And after reading some of your work, I've learned that flood justice can operate at a variety of scales and contexts. You've spoken on another podcast with Patricia Schwartz, which I would highly recommend for anyone who hasn't listened, about the inequality of green infrastructure in Tucson. Could you talk a little bit about that here and explain how flood justice manifests, or I should say flood injustice manifests in Tucson, and a little bit why green infrastructure is so important for flood mitigation?
Yes, absolutely. As I mentioned, flooding occurs because of these gray infrastructure systems and all these. So the original way to manage runoff and stormwater, the regular engineering approach, was to channel it and discharge it as far away and as fast as possible away from the urban infrastructure, from the cities. So we have canals that are lined with concrete and everything to direct flooding away, and not a lot of natural areas or impervious or pervious areas where water can actually infiltrate. So that was not the best approach. We've learned later the sediment accumulates over there, and the systems are not as healthy. The ecosystems are not as healthy. So the city has been, there are several programs to bring back these natural landscapes through green infrastructure or these basins, vegetated basins that direct stormwater to infiltrate in situ where it falls and don't get it accumulated into the gray infrastructure. The problem with the inequities are mainly that the first programs that were funded by the city through the water bill, so every customer of the water would pay a fee, like a $1 fee, and that pot of money, which is not a small amount, it's like last in the year 2018-2019, the fiscal year, it was $3 million, so it's a considerable amount. It funded rainwater harvesting systems, but the city they documented where those programs were being funded, and it was mostly on the white, wealthy neighborhoods. So we could see that the south side of Tucson, where it's mostly inhabited by low-income families of Hispanic ethnicity, they were not applying for this program. So the program had a lot of flaws. First of all, it was directed to homeowners, and homeowners, not everyone owns their home, and renters were not eligible, although they did contribute to the pot of money through their water bill, but they were not eligible, and that's a big inequity. Another inequity was that this policy did not consider the low-income communities. I mean, they were not at the table when it was framed. So there's a lot of things and strategies that the city is doing to correct these inequities. Like they partner with the Sonoran Environmental Research Institute, SETI, a nonprofit that gives grants or loans to low-income families to adopt these type of programs without the rebate part. And the rebate part is one of the big flaws, right? Because a rebate, the way it functions is you put the money up front and then you wait like 2 months or something for the money to come back to you. But who has $2,000 in their bank account that they don't need for 2 months? I mean, it's only the wealthy, and a low-income family may not be able to wait those 2 months. So that's where SERI came in to provide loans or grants for those $2,000 so they could wait until they come back. There are other issues with the programs that they require training of attending workshops, and some people just have two jobs and they don't have time to attend those workshops and things like that. So they are looking at the program closely to try to correct those inequities. But yeah, that's where the inequities of green infrastructure lie in Tucson, because right now mostly the wealthy families or the wealthy areas, they are visibly greener, and with green infrastructure, it's also less heat and less flooding. So the vulnerabilities to climate change are exacerbated in the vulnerable communities and low-income communities of our city.
So what I'm hearing you say, I think, Adriana, is that this green infrastructure, these projects can benefit folks that are vulnerable to climate change, both heat and flooding, and has a lot of really positive benefits for these communities.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the greening of cities is a trend all over the world. Cities are experiencing a lot of heat and flooding as well as, I mean, just as in Tucson, as a consequence of impervious surfaces of asphalt and concrete. And they are reimagining other ways of building cities, and it's mostly including nature. Green infrastructure is a way of nature, but there are also other types of green infrastructure like green roofs and bioswales and a lot of strategies to bring back nature, because nature is our ally. It's not as hot, it provides shade, evapotranspiration, some humidity, and it controls flooding naturally through infiltration of stormwater into the aquifers. And we get our water from the aquifers, so it's not such a bad idea to recharge the aquifers as much as possible.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that and going in for such great detail. At the Water Justice Knowledge Exchange event that you spoke at a few weeks ago with some of your collaborators and representatives from the city of Tucson, I saw a map from the city of Tucson for a green infrastructure program. It was noted that southern Tucson, as you sort of just said, was an underserved region of the city by this green infrastructure program. But I also noted that the city of South Tucson was completely missed from the map. Am I understanding correctly that residents of South Tucson don't qualify for the program because they fall outside the city of Tucson limits?
Just a clarification, Lucas. Are you referring to the city of South Tucson or to South Tucson? Because there is a difference. So when we hear South Tucson, people mostly refer to all the area in the city south of 22nd Street. But there is a small jurisdiction, the city of South Tucson. It's a small, a few blocks, it's not very large, and it's a city within a larger city. So the city of South Tucson is different from the city of Tucson. And yeah, there are, as you pointed out, there are inequities because the program, like the rainwater harvesting program, the rebate program that I just mentioned, for example, it's funded by all of the Tucson Water customers. And Tucson Water customers are all around the city and other jurisdictions, the county, the city of South Tucson, Oro Valley, Vail, Marana, other jurisdictions. but only those programs funded by everyone are only implemented within the jurisdiction of the city of Tucson. So you're right, there are some inequities there in terms of jurisdiction.
Thank you for clarifying. Yes, absolutely. That rings true for me, and I think is a really important element of flood justice that we need to be talking about. What I'm hearing you say is that poorer and largely Mexican American communities, like the city of South Tucson, this unique and distinct city, are excluded from these programs, as are, I suspect, unincorporated colonias like Summit, which is a informal community, unincorporated informal community about 20 miles south of Tucson.
Yes, if that residential area is outside the jurisdiction, yes, they would be excluded from these type of programs. You're right.
As you and colleagues from around the world have pointed out, rural and unincorporated places are particularly vulnerable. One element of this vulnerability I've seen and been thinking a lot about is the context of the Texas-Mexico Borderlands, where municipal undermounting, that is, the idea that cities will often unintentionally not incorporate communities so as to avoid the responsibility of providing services. Responsibility then largely falls to the county. I learned from your work with Chad Stadden that Pima County passed a climate change resolution in 2017, which led to a report on green infrastructure to reduce flooding. Could you tell me a little bit about that resolution, the results of the report, and how is Pima County addressing flood vulnerability?
Yeah, that was very, very important, that resolution. And the motivation to get this climate change resolution was mostly monetary, economic drive. In the political environment that we live, just mentioning climate change is sometimes not favorable. So the fact that a government agency like Pima County have a climate change resolution back in 2017 was a very, very big deal. But the issue was, or the big motivation was money. To get a bond or money for projects that people could vote on, they required that the county have this climate change resolution in place. So that was the main driver, to be eligible to get a bond. And the bond was voted, and the people did approve this pot of money that would be funding a lot of projects to build resilience and against climate change. And yeah, that's how they got some pot of money to do that.
Wow, yeah, thank you for sharing that. I guess I never thought about, the connections between climate change, green infrastructure, and finance and capital and lending and bonds. Thank you for sharing that. I'd like to pivot now from Tucson and Pima County to Ambos Nogales. Regarding the theme of flood justice, as I understand it, Nogales, Sonora has an outsized vulnerability to flooding. There have been several major flood events in the last several decades, with the most recent severe flood in 2018. Could you walk me through why that is and what the consequences are for flood-vulnerable communities in Nogales, Sonora?
Yes, of course. I mean, water management in Ambos Nogales, it's really a fascinating topic. It's really a mess, but a fascinating mess. Something that in other cities happens every 200 years or a 500-year event or something really, really catastrophic. It happens every other year in Ambos Nogales. People die. People are really, really affected, and mostly on the Mexican side. The way water management in Nogales works, it's basically gravity. I mean, water flows north. That's the fact. I mean, the Mexican side, it's higher in elevation. So for better or for worse, water flows north. That's in terms of stormwater, in terms of sewage, in terms of every water. So, and in addition to that, we've mentioned how the cities have lined their surface areas. Well, the problem is Nogales, the main roads are the rivers. So the rivers are not parallel to the roads. The roads are the rivers. So when it rains, guess what? Those roads act like rivers, and they carry all this water, and it's all hilly, so it's a lot of fast runoff, and it's a real mess. And then the sewage system is underneath those same roads. So when the flooding is there, and the flooding is much more aggravated by the border wall after 9/11 of 2001, the border wall was very much hardened, and it's not as pervious as it used to be. So that contributed a lot to the blockage of this stormwater runoff that it's flooding the Mexican side. So then when it's all flooded, and it's within seconds, and it's really dangerous, and there's flash floods, and people die every other year, as I mentioned. It's a tragic, very, very tragic. Children, women, I mean, anyone who doesn't know how to transcend the city or get around in the city when it rains, they will take the wrong turn and get on the road that they shouldn't have to, and then they can just perish. But then everything is flooded. Even the roads, people took out their trash, for example, for collection, and within seconds, all those trash cans are knocked off. The runoff is mixed with debris, with trash, and then many times the manholes explode, or even some of them are taken out by residents who want to really get the flooding receded. But that is a big catastrophe, because then stormwater gets combined into the sewage system. And that's where things go really, really bad, because they get mixed, and then they get all into the U.S. As I mentioned, it runs, water flows north. So all the water combined, sewage, flooding, trash, debris, everything gets into the U.S. And then in the U.S., all the sewage regularly is collected and conveyed to the treatment plant in Rio Rico, Arizona, 9 miles north from the border. But that conveyance system is called the International Outflow Interceptor, or IOI. And that conveyance system, that aqueduct, had a lot of holes, lack of maintenance, and lack of delineated roles and responsibilities. It's a big management problem. Who owns that IOI? Because no one wants to own it, because whoever owns it has to maintain it, right? And it lacks maintenance, so it leaked. It leaked a lot. Right now it's undergoing some repairs, so it's not supposed to leak anymore. But when it leaked for many years, so whenever there was flooding, we had raw sewage on the open canals on the Arizona side. And raw sewage is nothing good for your health. So, and it violates all the Clean Water Act and all the regulations that you can think of. So a lot of health problems. And so as you can see, we have everything of a problem that can happen in cities, in just these two sister cities in the US-Mexico border.
Thank you for detailing that so thoroughly. I understand that the flow of water from Sonora to Arizona has benefits and consequences, but I don't completely understand this complex process. Could you walk me through the ways that Southern Arizona both needs this flow of water from Mexico and the public health consequences here?
Yes, of course. Well, the key part to understand here, Lucas, is that water in the desert is a very precious resource. Even raw sewage, it has water. I mean, raw sewage is even valuable here because you can treat it, and you can just treat it, clean it, and then you have effluent and reclaimed water, or something you can do with that water. So yes, it sounds like Mexico sends all the bad stuff to the U.S. There's sewage and these disgusting things, and the U.S. suffers because Mexico sends. But the truth is that this sewage is treated in the Rio Rico plant that I mentioned, the Nogales International Wastewater Treatment Plant, and that effluent is Mexican. So it's Mexican water, but it's super hard to return it to Mexico. You have to build an aqueduct and, run it past many properties and get that permission and then pump it. And it's very costly, and Mexico doesn't have money to do that. So they just let the U.S. keep it. But the U.S. cannot really use it because it doesn't belong to any agency, any developer. So they just let it run. They run upstream on the Santa Cruz River. And then we see all these benefits of that effluent, bringing back life to the Santa Cruz River, bringing back endangered species like the Gila top minnow, that this cute little fish that we have here that is endangered. We have it back in the Santa Cruz River. And then all these economic benefits, because the river with water and with green trees and cottonwoods, it's nice. It's nice to live there. So it brings property prices up, and it's nice to live in Tubac and all that. So lots of economic and ecological benefits and social benefits, except that none of the two cities of Nogales enjoy any of those benefits. They are enjoyed north of Rio Rico. That's the sad part of this story.
Thank you for detailing that. When we think about water and transnational water treatise, what I'm hearing you say is the U.S. can't use that water because it belongs to Mexico. So what I'm hearing is that water in this transnational desert is highly regulated, and that you can't just simply use the water. The government can't simply use the water. That it belongs to Mexico, and either it needs to be returned to them, or used, or I guess not used, but simply treated, but sort of left to sort of create this wetland.
Yeah, not so much wetland, but it's like for the river to be drained on, and because in Arizona there is absolutely not a drop of water allocated for the river for ecological uses, they call it. No, and that's a big flaw of the water law of the 1980s, that the major water managers have recognized that all of the rivers have been allocated, all the water, the last drop. They know underground and in the surface, they know who's going to use it in the next 100 years.
Wow.
So the fact that we have a running river here of water that you cannot use, it's really precious. It's really singular. And it's because of these transboundary regulatory systems that you mentioned, for sure.
Absolutely. I mean, thinking about water transnationally, flood justice transnationally, I think is so important, and really the core theme of this podcast. I recently facilitated a Flood Justice Across Borders panel for the Flood Justice Symposium that was developed by Hannah Friedrich and Dr. Beth Tellman, along with yourself, of course, as well as a large group of incredible scholars and activists from around the world, too many to name here. As you mentioned, as you know, I really wanted you on the panel, but I know that you were very busy and were unable to come for the panel discussion. But instead, you recommended Joaquin Marrufo at the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality. And I was so pleased that you did. He's such an engaging speaker. And from that conversation, I learned a little bit about the transnational collaboration between Arizona and Sonora, between the U.S. and Mexico. And I know it's quite complex with, water treaties dating back to the 1940s. And you've sort of already alluded to this, but in this sort of complexity and sort of some of the holes and issues here. But could you walk me through some of those levels of collaboration that we see with regard to flooding in Ambos Nogales? And could you tell me about how this collaboration has been important for reducing flood vulnerability?
Oh, yeah. Collaboration is certainly key, especially in the border, because border people who live there, they recognize that the two cities are interconnected. There is no border wall that can just shield them from everything that happens on the other side. On both sides, I mean, Mexico is also deeply affected by what happens on the U.S. side. And it's better for both if they collaborate. So you mentioned the water treaty in the 40s, and that was a big deal when the two countries could actually negotiate and agree on water back in the day. And that was, there was other developments of that treaty, the La Paz Agreement and so forth. But then in the 90s, we have NAFTA, right? The North American Free Trade Agreement. I got it right this time. That brought a lot of more cooperation, but very importantly, money for infrastructure. They created the North American Development Bank, a bank that is funded by the two sides of the border, mostly from the U.S., but there's money for infrastructure, for water infrastructure, for sewage, for pipes, for all these needed infrastructure. And they have been operating in the border for the last 25 years. They recently got their 25-year anniversary, and they built sewage systems, wastewater treatment, running water infrastructure, and that is because of these two parties, of the collaboration between the two countries at the federal level, and with big money, that's for sure. But I want to emphasize here the importance of collaboration at the local level, because for the two countries to sit together, you need so many official things to happen, and it's really hard sometimes. There are political reasons and so forth. But at the local level, you have cousins on both sides, families, relatives, friends. Some people study on one side of the border but go to sleep to the other side. Or some persons live on the U.S. side but go to Mexico for the dentist or for groceries or for restaurants, for the food or whatever. So there's cross-border crossing, very, very intense at the local level and with family, relatives, friends. So this collaboration is the most impactful because they can really overturn or ignore these big official requirements for collaboration and just do things. Like this, there is this famous picture of a fire truck on the Arizona side sending water through the wall or a fence on that time, because it was an early photo, trying to put out a fire on the Mexican side. I mean, if you could put the two states to talk about passing water from one side, they would never do it, and they needed to do it at that moment to put out a fire. And they just did, because they were cousins, and they could just call them and have them send water through on top of the wall. So isn't that amazing? Collaboration at the local level is really, really key to solving flooding and other issues.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that really wonderful story of communities coming together, across, through, over an international border wall. So what I'm hearing you say also is that these kinds of collaborations need to be formal and informal, and need to be multi-scalar at the scale of the federal government, the state government, local government, but also at the kinship network, communities, friends, accomplices. That's sort of what we need to tackle transnational flood justice.
Definitely, yes. Grassroots organizations, champions that work on the ground, that know their neighbors, that are trusted by them. Trust is really key here to implement things at the very big level. You need people on the ground who have the trust. So in one of the papers that we published with Patricia Schwartz, in particular, the one you referred to, we were really recommending to inject resources and support these local champions who are already doing the work, planting trees, doing green infrastructure things at the local level. Just give them more resources, and that's probably the best way to go forward.
Absolutely. I love it. Well, Adriana, I've got one more question for you. So when you just talked about Patricia Schwartz, and earlier this year you co-authored a wonderful piece with several other scholars about some solutions to the very issues we've been talking about today. At the risk of asking you to summarize the paper, I was hoping we could end today with you just discussing some ways to tackle flood injustice in the borderlands. what do you see as the most effective ways that we can act flood justice in this flood vulnerable region? Referencing everything we've talked about today, green infrastructure, collaboration. This paper, I think, was really, really a fantastic summation of so many of our conversations. But I think, in your own words, if you could just talk us through about what sort of hopes do you see?
Yeah, well, thank you for reading the paper, first of all. But anyway, that's the idea, to outline some solutions, right? To have some pathways. And we've seen that green infrastructure, or the involving the natural systems, bringing it back to the city, is really a low-hanging fruit, because it's a decentralized solution. So it's not like the water agency has to get funding to do that, and they implement top-down centralized approaches to water management. That doesn't work here, and it's less likely in the borderlands, because you have all the complexity of 2 countries, 2 states, 2 municipalities, 2 cities trying to agree on something. That's really, really hard to do. But green infrastructure, planting trees, anyone can do it. The poor can do it, the wealthy, and it's a little like acupuncture solutions. My colleague Francisco Lara Valencia from ASU uses that term, because that's something doable. Any little piece of vegetation, a boulevard, a sidewalk, a school, campus, church campus, and any little piece of vegetation, and retrofitting as well. Parking lots, making it there or more green, sacrificing probably a few spaces, but bringing back nature everywhere is a big part of the solution. It's not the solution. Let me be clear. We've done some studies to quantify the benefits of green infrastructure, and it won't solve the flooding problem in Nogales. It's not the solution, but it can help ameliorate and mitigate for sure, and bring a lot more benefits than just flood mitigation. I mean, we've spoken about heat, and heat, we know it's a big issue in Arizona and Sonora. But all the other benefits, like a better air quality and just less stress, just being with nature helps everyone. So yeah, I would advocate for green infrastructure, and also with the equity part. If you green streets, just the street, even if there are no parks close to people, but if they have access to a street, right? So greening those networks of streets as corridors that connect the few parks that there are, we could build equity in this transformation of cities that we think will happen, because we need to. Yeah.
Fantastic. Wonderful, Adriana. I know I said last question. I do want to ask one more, because I've been thinking about this. I know that you do a lot of wonderful work with schools. I've read about your work at a high school here in Tucson. I think you're also recently done some more work in Nogales, Sonora. I also understand that you also very recently were awarded a grant to do more sort of a really sort of very innovative mentorship program with students. And so I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the importance of collaborating with children, with students, when we think about climate justice, when we think about flood vulnerability. Why students? Why education? Why is this so important?
Well, it's our future. I mean, the students, now they're in middle school, but you blink and now they're in high school, and then all of a sudden they are in college. And so middle school students are a very, very important group, because they are still are very open into what their careers can be. They're open to, probably they can go to college, or probably they won't. And they are very also open to how the world is, that they have the opportunity to live now. It's a mess with climate change, but they just see it as, okay, it's a fact, it's happening, but they also need something to do. And green infrastructure, all these strategies, it gives them hope of something they can actually work and contribute to making this a better place. So it's instilling in them a little bit of hope and not so depressing topics, and give them some tangible tools to pursue, and then also encouraging them to pursue a higher level of education. Middle school students are just the sweet spot for that. Elementary school is too young, and high school is apparently too late. So that's why we are targeting middle school students to just try to build a better world through capacity building and education.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Adriana, for detailing that. You talked about maintenance a little bit, and these sort of sometimes these projects come up and they're created and they're done, but there's no one to maintain them. You know, one of the most affective elements of reading some of your work was the work in Star High School here in Tucson, where you were going to do a really implement a green infrastructure project to mitigate and minimize flooding and heat vulnerability for this high school in the southern part of Tucson. And I read that the principal, she had to by hand re-water the plants that another organization had come in and sort of given to the school. And I had this sort of image of this principal that's doing all this work and is so busy and is responsible for all these kids. And also she's got to sort of walk around her school's campus and water these plants by hand. And it kind of just broke my heart a little bit. And just sort of thinking about the importance of maintenance and the importance of buy-in and the importance of having sort of communities sort of, know what they're getting into when it relates to equity and justice and sort of making these things, maintaining these projects. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that, about why maintenance is so important. It seems trivial, but it seems like it's actually at the core of what we're talking about when we think about grounded, community-based green infrastructure and flood mitigation, and really ultimately flood justice.
Well, you hit the nail in the head with that one, Lucas, because maintenance is a key factor for doing community engagement work, because you need people to know what's happening and to have their consent if they're going to be in charge of watering the plants or the trees that are planted. And it's not only for these green infrastructure solutions, but also for gray infrastructure, operation and maintenance. They call it O&M. That's always some of the lacking funding. They, like the Nat Bank, they fund infrastructure, big infrastructure projects like water treatment plants and so forth, or the aqueduct, the IOI that I mentioned. But no one thought about maintenance, and no one's taking care of them. And and it takes resources, and it's a constant flow of resources that are needed to maintain infrastructure, green infrastructure, or a combination of both. Everything needs this support for maintenance. I would argue that green infrastructure needs less maintenance than gray infrastructure. It's cheaper, but the responsibility is not clear. Who does this? Is it Department of Transportation? Is it the city? Is it flood control? Is it the resident? If it's in the public area, if it's Parks and Rec. So who owns that, or who is in charge of the maintenance is key for the effectiveness of that. Because green space, if you don't maintain it, it's actually a bad thing to have. It becomes a derelict space that fosters crime, and it's really not good to be living there. And it will eventually be developed, because if no one uses it, and it's just fosters crime. So for its success, it needs to be maintained. So really you hit the nail on the head with that one. And that's why community engagement, stakeholder engagement, talking to people becomes so important, because if they have a saying on what goes there, what design is there, what type of plants, what they can get out of there. Maybe there's art component that they build there for kids and schools. Everyone that has a stake on that would care if it's water or not water. So yes, community engagement to address maintenance. However, I would just like to add that the city of Tucson passed another bond for maintenance. So they are really solving this big issue that we see in other cities in the world. Well, Tucson has it solved through another fee on our water bill to maintain existing green stormwater infrastructure. However, I do see some inequities here as well, because they will be maintaining what was already installed. And where is that installed green stormwater infrastructure? In the wide, wealthy neighborhoods. But anyway, that's they are solving the maintenance crux here, and I think that that's a very good thing. And they are now targeting the low-income communities for their for green infrastructure and the maintenance. So are very much cognizant of the equity implications of the funding and trying to address those at the core. So congratulations to them for that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, Adriana. We really appreciate it. This has been just a fantastic time together, and I know I've learned a lot, and I've always really appreciated your tutelage and being here at this department with you. So this is absolutely thank you for coming, and thank you for joining us on the Flood Justice and las Fronteras podcast. Stay tuned for the Spanish language episode.